Today we are joined by Eric Jay Dolin. Eric is the New York Times bestselling author of Black Flags, Blue Waters, the epic history of America's most notorious pirates, which will be linked in the description below. In this riveting narrative, Eric reveals the surprising history of American piracy's golden age, from the late 1600s to the early 1700s, when lawless pirates terrorized the coastal waters of North America and beyond. Eric also depicts the stars of this era, including Blackbeard, Captain Kidd, and the sadistic Edward Lowe, who got off on torturing his enemies. The following conversation cuts through the romantic mythology of pirates and uncovers the true story of their despicable deeds. Enjoy the episode. Eric, welcome to American History Gazette.
Thanks for having me on.
Now, I know you've mentioned before that you didn't know much about pirates going into writing this book, and I'm curious to know what your expectations were going into the writing and research process, because obviously pirates have such a romantic mythology about them. We have such this ideological view of them in our society today. So did you have those expectations going into your research, and how quickly did those expectations change?
I have to tell you, I didn't really know a lot about pirates. I knew a fair bit about Pirates of the Caribbean movies and some pirate movies. And the reason I wrote this book, at least part of the reason, was that when I had a couple of ideas, I was pitching them to my teenage kids. And when I mentioned the possibility of writing a book on pirates, just because it's a fun topic, they said, "Dad, you have to write a book on pirates." So that got me really interested in pursuing this. And I'm being totally honest. When I started reading and actually researching the book and putting together the proposal, which it was fairly detailed, I was blown away by learning so many things that I knew absolutely nothing about. Like I knew nothing about Blackbeard beyond his name. Most of the other pirates I mentioned in the book, I had never, ever heard of in my life. I knew about Treasure Island. I hadn't read that book, so I didn't know a lot about what was in it. I had seen an adaptation of Treasure Island, both an older one with Wallace Berry, I think, and the Muppets Treasure Island. And I had seen a couple of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, and that was basically about it. So it's not an exaggeration to say that almost everything I learned in writing this book was a complete and total surprise, and a pleasant surprise, because I don't want to write a book about fluff. I want to write a book that I can tell the story and also get some insights into American history. And pirates had a much larger impact on American history and English history than I ever could have expected.
Yeah, I'm sure you were quite blown away because your book cuts right through all of that, and it's very honestly harrowing. I mean, these guys, they were not good guys. Some of them were there for the adventure out on the sea, but these were, most of them were horrible people, and they did horrible things. And your book is very dense, so I'm sure you found plenty of material to work with, and like you said, you were pleasantly surprised by that. But what are some of the common myths that you found about pirates that weren't necessarily true?
Oh, well, one is sort of the implication that most pirates made money. Most pirates did not make money. Most pirates, especially during the height of the Golden Age in the 17 teens and early 1720s, more than 400 pirates ended up on the gallows. They were killed in that manner, and many of them were killed in battles. So it was only a small minority of pirates that actually made a lot of money and got to live out the rest of their lives. And actually, a part of the golden age that I write about prior to 1700 is something that nobody who thinks about the Pirates of the Caribbean even knows about. That's the only era of piracy, and we'll get into it, Red Sea piracy, where a number of pirates did walk away with considerable amount of money. So one myth is that pirates made a lot of money. A few of them did very well, and that was enough to get other people excited to follow in their path, sort of like going into a casino and thinking you're going to win. Well, if a few people didn't win, nobody would go into casinos, but the vast majority of people lose, and that's certainly the case with pirates. Another myth that I thought was fascinating is walking the plank. I didn't find a single example of any pirate of the Golden Age, which is roughly the late 1600s, late 1600s to the early 1700s, actually walking the plank. Why would they? If they wanted to get rid of somebody, they could just run them through the cutlass or shoot them or just pitch them over the side. So that's a famous trope that you often hear coming from Hollywood. Also, I have no evidence that any pirates of that age actually said "arg." They probably had various utterances, but that seems to be more a byproduct of the mid 1900s, when there was a Welsh actor. I'm spacing on his name right now, but there was a Welsh actor who was in a number of movies, and he dispensed args with relish. One thing that was true is a lot of pirates did dress up fairly flamboyantly if they captured vessels on which there were silks and other nice pieces of clothes or jewelry. So in that respect, Johnny Depp might have hit the mark. Another myth is that they had a woman in every port. They didn't. There were a couple of ports, maybe Madagascar, where there actually were women, and in Nassau in the Bahamas, but they weren't going to every port. They didn't have a woman in every port. It was sort of a brutish life. They didn't have women on board, and just the imagery of being these sort of lovable characters like Johnny Depp or Captain Jack Sparrow or Long John Silver in Treasure Island. You know, they did bad things, but they actually were lovable, sort of uh, sympathetic characters. I didn't find any evidence of that whatsoever. They were simply brigands or thieves who happened to pursue their livelihood on the open ocean.
Yeah, I love your analogy of gamblers going to this casino because I think it's spot on. A lot of these guys, they hear, the very rare scenarios where guys like Henry Avery come back with all this treasure and they get their hopes up in their mind and they're like, I'm going to set out and I'm going to become a pirate. And 95% of the time, I would say they utterly failed and they were just living in constant state of desperation. They stopped looking for gold and they started looking, pl- what's the word? Plundering ships for food.
Yeah, oh, yeah, food. I mean, most of the times they didn't know what the merchant ships had on them, except if you go back in time, the Spanish galleons tended to have a lot of, the Manila galleons tended to have real treasure on board. But most of the ships that they overhauled were carrying lumber, flour, rum, iron, not not silver and gold. So yes, they often had to make off with something that was less glamorous and not what they intended. And so yes, it is like the casino analogy, and even life on board. Just think about it. These vessels may have been 60 feet long, 70 feet long. Some of them were longer, some of them were shorter. But because pirates had to overawe and overwhelm their victims, they often could have 70 or 80 guys on board. Now, they went through long periods of not attacking anybody, but imagine having 70 or 80 somewhat disreputable individuals who are probably pissed off because they haven't had a big score yet, and they have miserable food to eat, and they have occasional liquor to drink, which helps takes the edge off. But 70 or 80 people on a 70-foot or 60-foot snow or sloop, that's really crowded conditions. And we don't have a lot of reports of fights breaking out among the pirates, but I wouldn't be surprised if it happened. They certainly got on each other's nerves. And the other way to think about it is society at that time, most people, other than the aristocrats and the merchants, were poor and led miserable lives and didn't live very long. So a lot of these pirates, they could have a life on land that was pretty miserable, maybe working in a farm or doing manual labor or being unemployed. So piracy, even though if they were sober about it, they realized they didn't have a very good chance of making a lot of money, they could con themselves into going on a pirate ship and hoping that this one is going to be the one. It's just it's fascinating, and I know a lot of people who love pirates and love to go to pirate festivals. And I had a couple of people come to my talks dressed as pirates. I have no problem if you want to get excited about pirate movies and you want to dress up as Captain Jack Sparrow, and you want to swill rum and say arg to everybody and oh hoy matey, and it's fine. I love those movies, and but Hollywood is not where you should go for your true history. And anybody who wants to romanticize the life of the pirate, I think, is making a true historical mistake. But they do that all the time. People romanticize whaling. I wrote a book on whaling called Leviathan. There was nothing romantic about being on a whaling vessel, certainly in the 1800s at the height of the golden age of whaling. And there was nothing romantic about being on a pirate vessel.
Yeah, I think you explained it very well. I mean, these are 60, 70-foot ships. There's dozens, sometimes 100, over 100 people on these ships, and they're all angry men who are drunk and who have gone long periods of time without a score and on miserable food. So I'm sure it got very angry, very contentious, very claustrophobic. But how much of it do you think was seeking, financial gain as opposed to some who just wanted adventure out on the water? Because I know there was a minority who fall under that latter category. I know you use a quote in your book. One pirate said, "The love of drink and a lazy life were stronger motives than gold," in terms of pulling him into a life of piracy. So how much of it was seeking financial gain and how much of it was people who just wanted adventure?
I don't know what the percentage is, but I think you're right that it's a combination. And that quote certainly points to that. A lot of them just had no other alternatives that seemed to be better. And what they imagined life at sea to be like might have been much better than what they were actually living on land. And also, a lot of these people, if you're going to become a pirate, given the reputation of pirates, you got to be a pretty tough person, maybe a nasty person to begin with. So just like people today who are thieves and do horrible things to other people, they don't fit into society so well. So maybe the most of the pirates were just similar to the people today who would be bank robbers or scammers or people bilking old people out of their fortunes by, you know, uh, entangling them in romantic entanglements online and then scamming them. I mean, there are a lot of miserable people in society. Fortunately, most people I think are good. But back then, there were a lot of miserable people in society and people that were up to no good. And there's certainly more than enough of those kinds of people to voluntarily become pirates. Now, that's not to say all of them were horrific people, although it's hard to defend the main purpose of being a pirate, which is to steal from other people. Another myth, oh, this is another great myth, that they were Robin Hood's men, that they were out there stealing from the rich to give to the poor, that they were into this redistribution of wealth, that they wanted to establish a pirate kingdom someplace. That's all baloney. If they were Robin Hood's men, they certainly wanted to steal from the rich or anybody they could, but the only people they wanted to give money to was themselves. They didn't give money to local homeless shelters or the equivalent of the day. They didn't distribute it to the people. When they were pirates prior to the 1700s, the Red Seamen, they did share it with their friends and family, but that was a very different kind of piracy than what most people think of when they think of pirates and they think of Blackbeard. And Blackbeard is a wonderful example of mythology rolled up into one individual. He only had a career of about a year and a half. He did not make a lot of money. We have no evidence that he made a lot of money. He came to a grisly, deadly end, and his name was so memorable, but they depicted him even then as this violent character that shot one of his crewmen just to show that he was boss. But we have no evidence based on the ships that he actually pillaged that he was violent at all. We have one instance of him whipping somebody on board a ship. So his image became so far beyond what the reality was even during his time, and that now we have movies about Blackbeard, and he's shorthand for what everybody thinks about a mythical pirate individual. I mean, look at Captain Morgan, another great example. Captain Morgan's spiced rum. Look at the image on the rum bottle. It's just we romanticize this stuff when there wasn't anything romantic. But the way I look at it is, I don't have to write about people I like, but they were important in history, and their stories of what they actually did were fascinating. You don't need to cloak them in mythology. You don't even need to make them more than they were, because what they were was interesting enough, I think.
Yeah, I 100% agree. They had such an integral and often under realized part in shaping the American colonies. But, like you said, these were very selfish people. They weren't out here donating to nonprofits. But I'm curious, what did everyday life look like for a pirate out on the ocean?
Well, they were pretty cramped conditions because there were a lot of individuals on board. The food was not particularly good, and that's any mariner of the day. Once you're out at sea for more than a couple of weeks, your food is not going to be good. And as time went on during the Golden Age, they had fewer and fewer places to go to replenish. So they relied on what they captured on board ships, their victims. So the food wasn't good, the conditions were cramped, probably smelled. There was lice, there was vermin, there were probably rats on board, there were cockroaches, and it was sort of like periods of punctuated equilibrium. For long periods, there was probably not much to do. They would drink, they would go to where they thought they could find merchant ships, but the ocean's very big and you don't always come across merchant ships, and they didn't have shipping manifests that they could look at and say, oh, that ship's loaded with this. They're going to be here off of St. Kitts on this day. Let's go there. So they basically had to wander the world's oceans and looking for vessels. And then once they found one, they didn't know what kind of vessel they were coming up against unless it was a warship. They didn't know whether this merchant vessel would have anything of value on board. So there were long periods, no doubt, of boredom. And then there were short pulses of sometimes great excitement and potential death. They didn't get into battles that often because most merchant ships were not well defended. Pirates had a bad reputation because occasionally they would attack individuals and kill people who resisted. So most merchant ships who saw a pirate's flag aloft on the main mast would quickly surrender. And they used intimidation as their number one calling card. So I imagine being a pirate was fairly boring for long periods of time, and there might have been quick, sustained minutes or hours or even days of frantic action and fighting in some cases. And then they went back to their boring lives. And when they were able to pull into Nassau in the Bahamas, they probably drank a lot, and there were some women there, and they had fun, and they just hung around. And in Madagascar, they did the same thing. But as the Golden Age wore on into the late 17 teens and 1720s, Nassau, as a pirate haven, was totally shut down by the British, by the English at the time. Well, they were British by that point, by the British forces and Woodes Rogers. So they had no place to go. They had to sort of come into isolated harbors and bays and get whatever they could. They couldn't sail in 1716 or 1713 or 1721. A pirate ship could not sail into Boston and Philadelphia, pull up to the wharf and say, "We need supplies." They would be quickly attacked and surrounded. So they were persona non grata. But again, it was different for the pirates prior to 1700, the Red Seamen, because they were in cahoots with local elected officials, and they were the sons, fathers, and brothers of the colonists themselves who went halfway around the world to attack Mughal ships that were transiting between the Red Sea ports of Jeddah and Mocha and the Indian subcontinent. And those ships had a lot of treasure on board, and often a lot of times they had pilgrims going to Mecca. So they were rich targets, and they were considered infidels by the Christians back in the colonists. They were Muslims after all. So it was not seen as a sin to steal and even kill them and take money from them and then bring it back to the colonies, who were starved of currency and other types of East Indian goods. So it was a much different picture in the 1690s, when somewhere along the lines of maybe 40 of these ships went to the Red Sea, and many of them came back with considerable amounts of money, and they were welcomed back because the governors had sold them their fake letters of marque, thinking they were going to go out and fight the French, but they didn't. They went off to be pirates. And then when they came back, they paid the governors sometimes as much as 100 pieces of eight per pirate to have permission to go into New York Harbor, to go into Philadelphia, to go into these places unmolested. And then they melted back into into the local communities from which they had come. I mean, some of them ended up killed. Some of them got the wrong end of the stick, but a number of them were able to escape with their money intact. And I think that helped spur the golden age of piracy, the second half of it, which was in the 17 teens and 1720s.
Yeah, for sure. What you described does not sound like a romantic or fun life at all out on the ocean like that with vermin and lice, and that sounds horrible. But there's a few key labels or characters at play here, and I'd like to distinctly, identify them because the lines between them are often a little muddled. You have buccaneers who were around in the late 1600s. Then you have pirates, obviously, and privateers. And especially between pirates and privateers, the line gets a little foggy sometimes. So, what are the difference between these three labels?
Okay, Buccaneers were sort of the mid 1600s to the late 1600s. Henry Morgan. Um, Buccaneers were basically pirates. It's just another term, but it came from largely the Spanish, but also Dutch, English, and other individuals who settled on Tortuga near Hispaniola. They settled on an island there, and they started making what was essentially beef jerky, meat jerky, and they would make it on something called a boucan, which was a wood frame over a fire to dry the meat. So people called them buccaneers. They would sell their meat to passing ships, but the Spanish thought they controlled the entire Caribbean. So they didn't like these buccaneers operating in the Caribbean. So they attacked them on a number of occasions. So these buccaneers said, forget that. We're going to turn around and we're going to attack Spanish ships. So they got into small boats and then larger boats, and they basically became pirates. And they started attacking mainly Spanish ships, but after a while, any ship they could get. So those are buccaneers or buccaneers. And then pirates are just that. They're enemies of all mankind. They attack any ship that they find, and they're basically pirates at sea. Privateers people call them licensed pirates, but they really weren't. There were some privateers that were out and out pirates, like Henry Morgan, like Sir Francis Drake, because what a privateer is an individual during a time of war is issued a letter of marque by the government. It's a way of enhancing the Navy during times of war. So they're given a letter of marque that gives them permission to attack enemy ships during times of war. So if they actually go out, if England was fighting France and England issued letters of marque to individual merchants and their ships, and they were given permission to go out and attack French shipping, and they did so, they'd be operating as a privateer, and that was a well-established and accepted mechanism of warfare. But what the problem is a lot of privateers were given letters of marque during times when they weren't at war with the Spanish or the French or the English. And they went off and they basically attacked ships, and they were out and out pirates. And that was the case with the Red Sea pirates coming from the American colonies in the late 1600s, because they were given letters of marque that gave them permission to attack the French because England and France were at war at the time. But instead of attacking the French, they went out into the Indian Ocean and they attacked Mughal ships. So they weren't living up to the letter of their letter of marque. So those are the differences between the groups. And I actually wrote a book on privateering called Rebels at Sea, which was about privateering during the American Revolution. But so there were privateers that were nothing more than glorified pirates, but there are also privateers who were actually privateers. And then buccaneers is just another term for a different type of pirate during a particular era.
Interesting. It seems more often than not, privateers really ended up just turning to piracy because, like you said, gamblers walking into a casino, they couldn't resist seeing that treasure. And this really culminated with the Red Seamen and their immigration to the Indian Ocean. These were privateers quotation, privateers who came from the American colonies with privateering contracts or licenses to attack French ships because Britain and France were at war. But they saw all these Mughal ships coming from India with all this treasure, silk, gold. So walk me through how the Red Seamen came to be and how the piracy really exploded in the Indian Ocean following all of these, privateering contracts and war from Britain and France.
Well, there were a couple of early ships, English, British ships, actually, English ships at the time, in the late 1680s and the early 1690s that were in the Indian Ocean, and they attacked some Mughal ships, and they came back with a lot of money, and that word of that spread throughout the Atlantic world, and a lot of people who wanted to get some of that money then used the ruse of being privateers to go do it, but they couldn't have done it without the collusion of colonial governors who often didn't get paid very well by the crown, but they wanted to feather their nests. So colonial governors such as William Fletcher in New York City and other ones up and down the coast, they decided to sell privateering licenses, letters of marque, for upwards of £300 per person, letter of marque. And then it was known that they were going to go into the Indian Ocean and attack these Mughal ships. But they had this letter of marque, which gave them sort of some legitimacy or fake legitimacy, a cover. And then when they came back into port, they had to pay off the governors again. So it became this opportunity that people decided they couldn't pass up because a lot of Mughal ships were not well defended. But what happened is the Mughal Empire was one of the main trading partners with the British East India Company. The British East India Company was one of the main sources of income for the British Empire. So when the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb started complaining to the British East India Company that pirates were attacking his ships, and not only complaining about the pirates, but also shutting down trade between India and the Mughal Empire and the British East India Company, the British East India Company decided that it had to do something. So they sent out forces into the Indian Ocean and they clamped down on piracy in the American colonies. And by about 1701, the Red Sea men had been effectively vanquished and there was no more Red Sea piracy. But while Red Sea piracy was really going gangbusters in the 1690s, they had, just as their Atlantic counterparts later had a place that they could resort to, Nassau in the Bahamas, in the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea men used Madagascar as their base of operations. They had a little sort of pirate rendezvous there, and sometimes some people claim that up to 1,500 pirates could be there at one time. And a lot of those pirates had sex with local Madagascarian women. And actually, to this day, there are people who live on Madagascar that can trace their ancestry back to some of these Western European men who were in Madagascar, had sex with Madagascar women, and left children behind. So it's really a fascinating piece of history, but only lasted for about 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, that is very fascinating. I would love to travel back in time and kind of be on a fly on the wall during that, this booming pirate colony. There's probably pirates walking around everywhere. I'm sure you would see some really cool stuff. But this is why initially, especially in the colonies, they viewed piracy in a favorable light because they were bringing all of this money back to the colonies and stimulating the economy.
Right, absolutely. I mean, basically the colonies. Oh, no, I mean, the colonies always had a problem with England. The colonies were used as a money source for England of raw materials. England did not look at the colonies very favorably. They looked at them as a source of raw materials. They forced the colonists to buy any goods that they wanted with what little silver and gold they might have had. So silver was continually flowing out of the American colonies, going to England and other places. So they were continually short of currency. So here come these Red Sea pirates who bring a lot of currency into the colonies. Not only that, they bring a lot of these East Indian goods that would normally go to England and then they'd have to be resold by English merchants to the colonists at inflated costs. But here, the Red Sea men brought those goods directly back to the colonies. So it was viewed as a win-win by the colonies, and they didn't like being bothered by the mother country. And in fact, were quite upset when the mother country and the East India Company, spurred on by the East India Company, decided to clamp down on piracy because their source of goods and money was shut off.
Yeah, and I think you could argue that this is initially where the resentment started to build between the colonies and Britain, which would eventually culminate in the American Revolution, obviously. But I know another point of this is they saw the Mughals and the Muslims as infidels and kind of less human as the Christians, and they were completely fine with their guys going out into an ocean across the world and stealing from these people who they didn't really like. But a major player who came out of this period, one of the most infamous pirates, was Henry Avery, and he arguably was able to amass the greatest fortune of any pirate. So, who was Henry Avery, and how did he take command and rise to power, and what's his story?
Well, during King William's War, when England was at war with France, Henry Avery was on a ship that was supposed to be sent to the Caribbean to attack French vessels. It got a layover in Spain, and they stayed there for a long time, and these men weren't getting paid. So they were getting increasingly upset. They weren't able to send money back to their families. They weren't getting paid. They were getting frustrated. And some of the men came to Henry Avery, who was clearly a charismatic individual, and asked him to lead basically a mutiny of their vessel, the Charles II, and he did. And they took over the vessel, and they decided to go into the Indian Ocean and attack Mughal ships. They changed the name of the Charles II to the Fancy, and over a period of many months, he attacked a few very large Mughal ships that had a lot of money on board and a lot of pilgrims on board. And he also killed a number of individuals on those ships. And they got away with enough money, so it's estimated that his men, and there were hundreds, there were more than 100 of them, each probably had somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 pieces of eight in their pocket. And Henry Avery had even more. And that was a lot of money at a time when laborers could only, they'd be lucky if they earned a merchant, a mariner, a captain of a ship at this time. If he earned 50 pounds a year, he would be lucky. So this was a lot of money. And what happened is that Henry Avery disappeared. He went to the Caribbean, then he went back to England, and he sort of disappeared in the midst of history. Nobody knows what happened to him. There was even a play written about him that later was performed in Drury Lane in London. It was called The Successful Pirate. And there were a lot of myths that grew up about him, one of which is totally ridiculous, was that he married the emperor, Mughal emperor's daughter, and established a pirate kingdom down in Madagascar. That didn't happen. But he clearly wasn't captured, and he clearly got away. And his story of wealth uh, was spread throughout the Atlantic world. And that is part of what encouraged a lot of people to pursue the path of piracy. They all wanted to become the next Henry Avery.
Wow, that's incredible. He seems like he was the guy who hit the jackpot, and then everyone else after him thought that they could do the same, but ended up failing miserably. One of those people who came to an unfortunate demise was William Kidd, Captain Kidd, who actually came off the back of Henry Avery in the Indian Ocean, and he's regarded as one of the most infamous pirates ever. So, who was Henry Kidd, and why is he so famous?
Well, William Kidd, it's a very complicated story. I'll try to make it very simple. William Kidd, he had been a privateer, quote unquote, buccaneer early in the 1600s. He went to New York. He married a wealthy woman. He wanted to get a commission in the Royal Navy. He went to England. He wasn't able to get the commission, but some of his sponsors said, "Hey, this is during King William's War. how about we send you into the Indian Ocean to do two things? We give you two missions. We'll give you a letter of marque. We'll make you a privateer. You can go into the Indian Ocean. You can capture French ships if you come across them. But also, we're having a problem with piracy in the Indian Ocean. So why don't you go capture pirates in the Indian Ocean? So he was sort of a dual-use guy. The problem is he went back to New York. He recruited a bunch of people, and they were operating under privateering rules, which means no prey, no pay. Unless they captured something, they wouldn't earn anything. And a lot of them were former pirates, so they were an unruly crew to begin with. And essentially what happened is he went into the Indian Ocean. He attacked a couple of ships that weren't French ships, and got into he was a small scale pirate, and he captured a couple of Indian ships, Mughal ships, that did have French papers on board, but they were just ruses. They weren't really French ships. One of them was an Indian ship, one of them was a Dutch ship. But regardless, he gathered together a lot of money. But by that time, the East India Company and England had declared him an out and out pirate, and there was a worldwide manhunt for him. So when he got back to the Caribbean, he heard about this manhunt. He went back to Long Island in New York to confer with the local governor there, Governor Bellamont, who had been one of his initial sponsors, to see if he could get him off. And it's a very complicated story, but in the end, he wasn't able to get him off. The king had issued a sort of put a bounty on his head. Bellamont captured William Kidd, sent him across the ocean. The wheels of justice moved slowly. He was in jail for about a year. He was then tried, found guilty of not only piracy, but also killing one of his crew members, and he was sentenced to be hanged. He was hanged, but the first time they put the noose around his neck and kicked away pulled the wagon out of the way, the noose unraveled and he fell to the ground. So then they had to set him up a second time, and this time the noose was tied a little more tightly, and William Kidd went to eternity. And then he was placed in a cage, an iron cage, on a gibbet at the mouth of the Thames River, and he was slathered in tar, and he was posted there basically to be a warning to others who came up and down the Thames River that if you veer into piracy, this is what's going to happen to you. But there are people still to this day that debate that he wasn't really a pirate. He did, I believe, he engaged in piracy, but it was very small scale pirate. He wasn't a very successful pirate. The things with the French passes, it gets more complicated. I don't want to get into it. It gets more complicated. But I know that there are people, in fact, somebody who used to live in Marblehead, who's Irish, who's Scottish, he believes, and Kidd was Scottish, he believes that William Kidd was railroaded, and he's trying to spearhead an effort to get a statue to William Kidd placed someplace in Scotland and to get his record expunged. I don't think he's going to be successful, but there are people to this day still debating what William Kidd did, what he didn't do. It's a great story. No matter whether you believe he was a pirate or not, he wasn't particularly successful. He was an arrogant, not a very nice guy, apparently. And but his story is continually retold, and just like Blackbeard, his name is a byword for the age of piracy, and he's one of the most well known the pirates from the Golden Age.
Yeah, it's definitely a highly debated end for him. I mean, we can get into it briefly just to give the audience what happened is he had these French passes that you mentioned, and then during his trial, he wanted to present them as evidence that he was innocent. He was attacking French ships like he was supposed to, but they magically disappeared. Some say that was on purpose. Some say they were lost to history, but the evidence never came forth, and he came to his unfortunate demise. But that kind of wraps up our discussion in the Indian Ocean. Like you said, the East India Trade Company and the Mughals, they tightened down on piracy, and eventually they all go back to the Atlantic coast. And it's really here where we see a turning point in American sentiment towards piracy. So what do you think the catalyst was, or the turning point where they no longer viewed piracy favorably and they wanted to do everything in their power to destroy it?
Well, it's pretty simple. You just have to look whose ox is being gored. Prior to 1700, the colonies were benefiting from piracy, even though the crown and parliament hated pirates and they were breaking the law. After the War of the Spanish Succession, starting in 1713 up through the mid 1720s, the pirates were no longer benefiting the colonies. They were attacking colonial ships. The colonies were wealthier. So merchants were losing to the pirates, and no longer were pirates bringing whatever wealth they were able to obtain back to the colonies. So they were just viewed as out and out enemies of the people. So at this point, whereas prior to 1700, the colonies were at odds with the mother country. After the War of the Spanish Succession, the colonies' interests and the mother country's interests, or Great Britain, coalesced. They both hated pirates and they wanted to rid the world of pirates. So you got to follow the money. In history, so much of history is based on who's getting money, how are they getting it, and who's benefiting and who's not.
That's right. Money talks louder than anything. But I think it goes to show you that these weren't noble guys fighting for their country and looking to enrich their country. They were fighting for themselves. They were looking to plunder whatever they could get their hands on, and we really see that here. So piracy just kind of explodes in the Caribbean after the War of Spanish Succession ends. And there's two guys in your story who you say have one of the worst disasters in the history of piracy, and that's Samuel Bellamy. Forgive me if I'm not pronouncing the name correctly, but Samuel Bellamy, and Palsgrave Williams, and you say they have the worst disaster in the history of piracy.
Yeah, well, these guys, again, it's a very complicated story, but these guys go down to off of Florida. A bunch of Spanish treasure ships sank in a hurricane, and word got out, and a lot of people went down to dive near Vero Beach, not too far from Vero Beach, into the water to try to retrieve this treasure. Most of them were unsuccessful. Palsgrave Williams and Samuel Bellamy team up. They go down there. They get no Spanish treasure, but they're down there and they say, hey, let's become pirates. And they basically become small scale pirates and they work their way up the chain. And at one point, they had attacked and pillaged probably upwards of 50 ships. They had a fair amount of money, and then they hit the jackpot when they captured the Widow, which was a slave vessel, a British slave vessel that had just sold 500 slaves in Jamaica. So it was full of cash, which had been what had been paid for those enslaved individuals. So they captured the Widow. They had probably $20,000 to $30,000 in silver and gold on board. And so they were sitting pretty, but the problem is when they traveled up north, they were going to Maine, where they were going to careen the vessel, clean the vessel, and attack more ships. But as they reached the outstretched arm of Cape Cod, a nor'easter blew down the coast and essentially sank the Widow and all 165 men about 1,500 feet from the beaches of roughly where Eastham and what's the name? Yarmouth, that area on the Cape Cod. So they sank during the storm. Everybody but two people on board died. Bellamy and Williams was on another ship at the time, but Bellamy died, and all the treasure in the ship went to the bottom. So it was a horrific disaster for them. He not only lost his life, they lost all their treasure. And for hundreds of years, that treasure remained hidden. People knew about it. A lot of people went out and tried to find it, but it wasn't until 1984 that a guy named Barry Clifford, a salvager, and his team were able to use historic documents and modern sensing technology to find where the Widow was buried in the sand, not very far from Marconi Beach on Cape Cod. And they started recovering, and they've recovered thousands of pieces of silver, pieces of 8, and gold doubloons and cannons and shards of bones and wood. Just amazing. And if you ever go to West Yarmouth on the Cape, there's a museum, the Widow Pirate Museum, which is really worth visiting, if for no other reason than you get to stare at hundreds of pieces of eight and gold doubloons, but they also have cannons and they tell the entire story. Some of it is a little bit embellished, I think, but they tell basically the accurate story of what happened to the widow and Samuel Bellamy and Palsgrave Williams. So it's a great story. It's a whole chapter in the book. It's an unfortunate end for them because they weren't able to retire with their riches, but it's a great story for us to read.
Yeah, it's so sad that they had this unfortunate demise right after hitting the jackpot. And it's so fascinating. And forgive me if I'm not mistaken, but I think this is the only verified pirate shipwreck or pirate ship that has sunk to be recovered, correct?
Yes, there's one or two other ships where something's been recovered, but it wasn't clear to me whether they were really pirate ships. But this is certainly the best documented, if not the only, it's certainly the best documented pirate ship treasure ever found and recovered. And how much it's worth, I mean, at one point somebody claimed it was worth $400 million. I think that's way too high. But I have no doubt that that treasure, and they haven't sold any of it, if they ever did sell it, it would be worth many, many, many millions of dollars because a lot of their pieces of eight and gold doubloons are in very good shape. And a really high quality piece of eight from the early 1700s or the late 1600s, if you could look at coin auctions, they can sell for as much as 18, 20, $30,000 a piece. And then it's even more for gold doubloons. And when you consider that they've recovered thousands of these, it's a lot of money.
Wow, that is incredible. I would love to go visit that one day just to be able to see, I mean, really the only verified pirate recovery and all that gold and silver. That would just be so cool to me. But something that was kind of interesting, yeah, something that was definitely kind of interesting and funny about that part of the story is as soon as people got word that the widow wrecked, right off the coast, just hordes of people stormed the beaches searching for any kind of treasure they could find.
Oh yeah, people did that all the time. Whenever there was a wreck of any type, pirate ship, merchant ship, anything, the locals, both in Europe and in the colonies, would often become scavengers, and it could get quite violent. They get into fights, they steal from each other, they don't want to give it back to the local government. So there are certainly quite a few houses or families on the Cape and maybe beyond who probably have in their houses treasure, salvage items, if not from the widow, because some stuff did wash ashore, from other ships that have sunk or crashed into the beaches there. So yeah, it's very common. People, they're sort of like pirates on land. There was a word sent out when the widow sank. The local government caught wind of it very quickly. They knew, and the Governor Shute, sent a message out to the people of the Cape and sent officials out there saying, "Don't take anything from the wreck. Return what you found." Well, I don't think anybody returned what they found.
Yeah, that's not going to happen. But can you imagine how cool it would be to have a family heirloom that was from the wreck of the widow or any kind of pirate wreck, some kind of pirate treasure? I think that would be so cool. But is there any other, yeah, is there any other tales of pirate treasure that's still lost at sea that people are looking for? And if so, how much pirate treasure do you think is still lost at sea?
I don't think there's a lot. There are some stories and there are some people pursuing it. What you hear about more often than pirate treasure is Spanish treasure ships sinking in hurricanes or other events. And the Atoka was found off Florida. And there still are recovery efforts. And every couple of years you hear of a salvage effort. The SS America, which came from California during the gold rush years and sank a couple of, I think, 60 or 100 miles off of Cape Hatteras. That was recovered in the last 30 or 40 years, and thousands of ingots and gold coins from California were recovered, and that was worth a lot of money. So I don't think there are going to be many pirate treasures that are still out there to be found. And there's no evidence that any pirates buried treasure on land. So if you're hoping to find another widow like stash it may be out there, but highly unlikely to find it because if the ship sank, there aren't necessarily good records. The reason we know about the Witta is because a couple of people survived and it sank very close to shore. If another vessel got caught hundreds of miles offshore, a pirate vessel in the 17 teens, and they happened to have a lot of money on board, and everybody died, nobody would know where they sank, where they were. So it's unlikely, I think. Although I would love to find this stuff. I'd love to go along the beach in Florida or on the Cape with a metal detector and find an old coin, a piece of eight, or a gold doubloon. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, that would be so cool. Um, I would love to see a movie made about kind of a modern day movie or documentary made about finding the widow, kind of in a national treasure kind of vibe. I think that would be really cool, even just a documentary. But I'd like to flesh out the story of, I don't even think it's up for debate, the most infamous pirate of all time, a man by the name of Edward Thatch, also known as Blackbeard. So he kind of teams up with this guy, Stede Bonnet, I think is his name. He's referred to as the Gentleman Pirate. He teams up with him, and they wreak havoc on the Atlantic coast and the Caribbean. So walk me through Blackbeard's story, and you mentioned earlier in the conversation how he came to a very unfortunate demise with getting his head chopped off. So
Blackbeard was most likely, we don't know for sure, he's probably a privateer during the War of Spanish Succession, decided to go into piracy. He sort of appears in around 1714. He gathers together an increasingly large pirate armada, and at some time, Stede Bonnet, this wealthy sugar plantation owner from Barbados who decided to become a pirate, joins Blackbeard. Then he leaves Blackbeard, then he joins again. He's a different story. People can read the book. It's very interesting how it interacts. But Blackbeard, the biggest thing that Blackbeard did, he didn't get a lot of money from it, but he had 5 ships under his command. And he went to Charleston, South Carolina, and he basically blockaded the harbor for the better part of a week. And instead of demanding a huge ransom or attacking the town, which would probably be a pretty dicey proposition because they were fairly well defended, but he had a lot of prisoners because he got some merchant ships that were around the mouth of Charleston Harbor. So instead of demanding a lot of money, it apparently some of his men were suffering syphilis or some other venereal disease. So what he really wanted was some medicine. So he asked for a medicine cabinet, which is probably worth about 400 pounds sterling. But that's essentially all he got. And then he went up the coast, and everybody was all upset about this. And he ultimately ended up off Ocracoke Island. He interacted with the local North Carolina governor. He attacked a couple of more ships. He was carousing. He, never gathered a huge amount of money. But then the Virginia governor discovered this, and he helped send a force to root out Blackbeard and his men. And they were Royal Navy. They were from the Royal Navy, and they ultimately did. They tracked him down near Ocracoke Island, and there was a battle between two Royal Navy sloops. They actually were just basic sloops that the naval men commandeered because their bigger ships couldn't maneuver in that shallow water. They went down there, they snuck up on Blackbeard, they caught him after a night of carousing. There was a violent battle, a lot of people were killed. One of them was Blackbeard. His head was chopped off and placed on the bowsprit of his own sloop and taken back to Williamsburg. And as legend goes, they took his headless body and they pitched it into Albemarle Sound, where apparently his headless body took a few laps around the ship before sinking from view. So powerful was his personality that he still was animated without a head. So it was a very dramatic story. He had a very dramatic end. There's no evidence that he gathered a lot of money. It was almost the image of him was more scary than the reality of him.
yeah, it's really his death that probably gives him this infamous place in history. But they actually found, you know, remnants of a wreckage off of the coast of Ocracoke Island, and A lot of people speculate that this is the Queen Anne's Revenge, that this is Blackbeard's ship that sunk during this battle. And something interesting is they found, a French syringe from the wreckage, and you could argue, you state in your book that it's possibly from the medicine chest that he requested from South Carolina, which is so interesting.
Right. Well, actually, the Queen Anne's Revenge was not an Ocracoke. He went into another. I can't remember the inlet. What is the inlet? It's a famous inlet, and the Queen Anne's Revenge crashed. This is before the pirates sort of dispersed and went down to the Ocracoke area. But yes, the North Carolina, there was a salvage operation. The archaeologists down there are reasonably confident that this is the remains of the Queen Anne's Revenge. They've recovered cannons and pieces of wood and other items that lead them to that belief.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. Just recovering lost treasure is one of the coolest ventures I think humans can do. But this guy Edward Lowe, he was sick. He was sadistic. I mean, this guy was probably the worst pirate in history. So what are some of the things he did that made him so vicious?
Well, Ned Lowe was in the 1720s when piracy was really winding down. Pirates were under attack from all locations, all vantage points, and their lives were even shorter and more brutish than normal. So Ned Lowe came out of Boston. He became a small scale pirate down in the Caribbean. He was down there getting logwood, and then he decided to go into piracy. He had a little bit of success, but his trademark was I think he was psychopath. He liked to torture his victims. He would often cut off their ears and nose and roast the flesh and force them to eat it before running them through the cutlass. He did capture one Spanish ship down in the Bahamas that had more than 30 men on board. And when he captured the ship, the captain of the vessel had a bag of gold and silver on board, but he didn't want it to fall into the hands of the pirates. So he held it over the stern of the ship and basically cut the rope and let that bag of gold and silver go into the water. Well, somebody told on this pirate captain. Ned Lowe found out about it. He not only killed this pirate captain, ran him through with a cutlass, but he killed more than 30 of his crew members. He was so enraged. But what happened to him in the end, we don't know for certain. He wasn't killed by anybody that we know of, but he sort of fades into the mist of history. He wasn't a particularly successful pirate. He was a very notorious pirate. And one of the stories in the book that people can read about that is fascinating is he captured a number of fishing vessels off of Nova Scotia. One of them was from my hometown of Marblehead, Massachusetts. And one of the individuals on that fishing vessel, a guy named Philip Ashton, actually was forced to be a pirate for a while, but then he escaped down in the Bay of Honduras onto an island there, Roatan, and he lasted for almost 2 years before he was rescued by a passing ship. So he, in fact, became an American Robinson Crusoe who had escaped from the clutches of the evil Ned Lowe and survived on this island for quite a bit of time. Not always alone. There were some other people that came and went while he was there. But it's another fascinating story that's told in the book.
Yeah, that was probably one of my favorite stories from the book. I highly urge everyone to go read the book and especially read that chapter because, obviously you flesh out the story of Ned Lowe a lot more and Philip Ashton, and it is crazy how he survived by himself on an island for almost 2 years. But at this point, you mentioned civility is closing in on the world and piracy is fading away. The Golden Age is coming to an end. And this comes to a culmination with a man named William Fly, who mutinied, became a pirate, got killed, and his death, you say, marks the end of the Golden Age of piracy. So why does his death mark the end of the Golden Age?
Well, after him, there were very few cases of piracy until we get to the early 1800s. I mean, it didn't absolutely kill piracy. There are always going to be pirates, and there's still pirates today. But I had to find an ending point, and his was the exclamation point at the end because he was a relatively unsuccessful pirate that went up the coast, and then he got too greedy. He captured a number of ships. He had a number of prisoners on board, and some of the prisoners were pretty resourceful, and they rose up and they took over the ship. They put Fly and his men in chains. They sailed to Boston. Fly and his men, the men that were left, three or four of them, were put on trial, found guilty of piracy. They were hanged at the edge of Boston Harbor, right down the hill from Copp's Hill burial ground. And then after they were hanged, they were taken down. They were rowed out to a small island in the middle of Boston Harbor, and his men were buried. But William Fly, much like William Kidd, was hung up in a gibbet in an iron cage as a warning to everybody else that they shouldn't go into piracy. And as I state in the book, by that time the warning wasn't necessary. There were very few, if any, pirates still on the open ocean. And in the next couple of decades, certainly up through the American Revolution, the number of instances of piracy were very, very few. So that's where I chose to end the golden age of piracy.
Yeah, I was at a farmer's market a couple weeks ago, while we had already planned for this, and I was reading your book, and there was someone singing along at the farmer's market performing, and they started singing this song, and it was a pirate shanty that they wrote, and it was about William Fly. And they're singing this song about William Fly, and I double take, and I'm like, there's no way. I'm literally reading a book about this guy and piracy right now. I'm having this author on my podcast. It was such like a surreal coincidence, and I reached out to him on Instagram afterwards, and we talked for a little bit, and he's like, yeah, I wrote this song. And it was just such a coincidence, and it was so amazing. But when did the romanticization of pirates begin? Because you argue in the book that it really began right after the golden age ends in the early 1800s, and I don't know how that happens, because they must still have the memory of the ruthlessness of pirates on their mind. So how quickly did this romantic ideology begin?
Well, actually, there was a book written in 1724 called The General History of Pirates that mixed fact and fiction. And even at that point, a lot of it was rather romantic. They talked about a pirate society, Libertalia, that was established on Madagascar, which never happened really afterwards. So there was a lot of romanticism in that, and sort of making Blackbeard larger than life. So it started right at the outset, this successful pirate play that was written about Henry Avery. But people often discount the bad parts of the story, and they hold on to this concept. Who wouldn't want to just get on a boat, go out in the open ocean, decide your own course, pillage at will, and become rich and drink and have women in every port, sort of the image of the romantic pirate. So it started very early on, but it really got jet fuel with Treasure Island in 1883, Robert Louis Stevenson, and then in the early 1900s to mid 1900s, Hollywood discovered pirates, and you had dashing pirates like Errol Flynn and Long John Silver, and then we go to the more recent era in Disney's Pirates of the Caribbean ride, and then Johnny Depp and the Pirates of the Caribbean movie series, and Black Sails, the TV program, all of which mix fact and fiction. A lot of them are more fiction than fact, but they all sort of harp on this romantic image of the pirate. Because who wouldn't want to just chuck their workaday world aside and go off and pillage? I don't think it's personally that attractive. Even if I were to come rich, I don't like the idea of stealing from people. But a lot of people, they just sort of, I don't know. It's hard to say. Why do people like murder mysteries? It's horrible. You're reading about people being murdered, but it's probably one of the most successful genres of writing. Why do people love to watch movies about people murdering each other? Every Arnold Schwarzenegger movie or Sylvester Stallone movie or Jason Statham movie has a kill count in the hundreds, perhaps. But people love those movies, and I like watching some of those movies. So I can't explain human nature. But pirates are going to continue to be romantic figures, and there are hundreds, there are certainly scores, if not hundreds, of pirate gatherings throughout the United States every year where people just drink rum. There's international talk like a pirate day, September 19th every year. So pirate romanticism is not going to disappear.
Yeah, not anytime soon. But I think, movies like that, they give us insight into human psychology and they strike a chord in something within ourselves about something we may subconsciously desire. I think with pirates, it resonates with many people and their subconscious desire for freedom. I'm sure a lot of these people back then, they probably didn't have any firsthand experience with pirates, so they weren't necessarily familiar with the ruthlessness, and information travels slowly, so maybe they never heard the stories. And then when these dramatized books come along and they read this, they're like, this sounds amazing, because especially back then, you're kind of trapped in your small town. You live your life there. It's very boring, very monotonous. So you hear these epic stories of adventure. I'm sure it really resonates and sparks your imagination. But one more question for you. I know you're a busy, man. I don't want to hold you up for too long. Looking to today, like you said, piracy is still very prominent today, especially in Somalia and Venezuela. Like we had the movie Captain Phillips about, his ship being taken over by Somalian pirates. So how prominent is piracy today?
Well, it's not as widespread as it was back during the Golden Age, I think, but it comes in waves. And basically, you are going to get pirates wherever you have people in desperate economic straits. I'm not trying to justify it, but the Somali pirates were from a country that was impoverished, and they viewed piracy as a way to hold hostage these cargo ships and make money. Piracy off Venezuela was the same. The country was in economic free fall, and some people took to their boats and decided to make money another way. There are still pirates in some places in the Indian Ocean and in the Far East. There are some dangerous straits that even Lloyd's of London won't insure ships that go through those areas because there still are occasional acts of piracy. So I don't think that piracy is ever going to disappear as long as we're still sending things on ships of value, which we certainly are. Still, 90% of all the things we own and buy come to us via the ocean. But these cargo ships are taking more effective defensive actions. Sometimes they're placing military men on board, so they're not as soft targets as they used to be in the Captain Phillips example. So I think, unfortunately, there will be piracy as long as there are humans who want to steal from other people.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right. But Eric, I want to thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciated this. Your book was absolutely phenomenal. Fantastic storytelling, great narrative. If you guys want to check it out, Black Flags, Blue Waters, it'll be in the description below. Eric, thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.